Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
That was Judge Joan Donoghue, president of the World Court, on Friday, reading a part of the court order directing Israel to enable the provision of humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. The order was issued in response to an application by South Africa for provisional measures to force Israel to stop its war on Gaza until the underlying case charging Israel with genocide can be heard by the court at a later time. Almost immediately thereafter, the U.S. announced that it was suspending its funding to the UN agency in charge of providing humanitarian relief to Gaza. The UN Relief and Public Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East announced that it fired 12 of its 30,000 workers after the Israeli Foreign Ministry called for an urgent investigation regarding alleged involvement of those 12 employees in the attack of October 7th. Philippe Lazzarini, who's the Commissioner General of the agency, said in a statement that the Israeli authorities had provided his agency with information about the allegations. Lazzarini said the agency was opening a thorough investigation into the claims, and the U.S. State Department immediately released a statement saying it had temporarily paused funding for the agency. The New York Times reported Saturday that it was not entirely clear what the precise allegations were, how the employees were allegedly involved in the attack, or what kind of work they did at the UN agency. Stefan Dujarric is the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. On Monday, after mentioning the fact that the 12 employees had been dismissed despite the fact that there was no investigation yet held, in order to assure the flow of funding to the necessary services being delivered in Gaza, he said this.
There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza who rely on UNRWA's humanitarian work, who rely on humanitarian assistance, even more now than they did before. It is the work that UNRWA does remains critical today, and we very much hope that while UNRWA that a number of things have to happen at the same time. UNRWA has to ask OIOS to do this investigation. The Commissioner General, I think, has taken very swift and strong measures right away. At the same time, our humanitarian work needs to continue. Lives depend on it.
Dan Kovalik is an American human rights lawyer and peace activist. He's also an author and teaches international human rights law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. We spoke with him via Skype on Monday. So here we go. We have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, a rather mild granting of injunctive relief, and the real hard material thing there being, in essence, it translates to Israel do not interfere with the delivery of humanitarian aid. It was put in stronger terms that they had an affirmative obligation to enable it, but I would say that at least there'd be no factual dispute about stop bombing the trucks that bring in aid. And even that now has been negated almost immediately by the United States, with the U.S. cutting off, and its 7 or 8 or 9 allies, however many it is now, cutting off funding to the agency delivering the aid.
No, it's quite stunning, Don. Actually, two things have happened of quite significance. So amongst the things that the ICJ ordered was also to stop killing members of the group, meaning the Palestinians, which is one of the genocidal acts they're accused of. And of course, Israel killed over 400 people in Gaza within the 24 hours after that ICJ decision, which is much greater than the 200 plus people they kill on average every day. So they increased the killing when they were told to stop it. And when they were told to enable aid, they and their Western partners have decided to cut off aid to the main UN body that gives aid to the Palestinians. I mean, it really is a major thumbing of the nose to international law, to the United Nations, really to the world, because world sentiment is against what Israel's doing. And basically, Israel said, I don't care what the law says. I don't care what the World Court says. I don't care what the UN says. We're going to just keep going. We're going to double down, is what they said.
So we have all these, I don't know, this architecture of what I guess people still try to pass off as an international legal system. This court, the ICJ, being the court, part of the UN Charter that is responsible for handling disputes between nation states. This is where countries go to court to deal with each other when there are disputes. You have all these other institutional bits of framework, various treaties, the trade, and particularly trade and commerce have a number of different panels that are mediators or operate more or less in a fashion like a court to deal with disputes between states. Those are also, and there's no enforcement at the ICJ. If you prevail there, then you go to the Security Council and ask them to enforce it, and one or the other side is going to be represented there and veto that. So it has no teeth. The same with these treaties. With, you've got Cuba, for example, has been sanctioned by the U.S. for 63 years now. What do we do about international law?
Well, it's something that I've asked myself for a long time. I taught international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law for 12 years, and over that time, I became more and more, pessimistic about the use of international law to actually protect human rights. And, I came to the conclusion some time ago, and it's only reinforced by recent events, that international law is for the weak. It's not for the strong. The strong use it against the weak. It's the West in general that use it against the poorer countries of the world to keep them in line. It's not to apply to them. And that's what we're seeing right now. Again, a lot of us suspected that's what was going on. And now that's what's very clear, is that, all these things that you just mentioned that have been set up to, again, have some rule of law in the world, were not meant to govern the Western powers. It was meant to govern everyone else. And we're seeing that, really manifested right now.
So this is not an attempt to find justice among the various nations, but rather the architecture of empire. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think so. And I don't think it necessarily was that one. It was inked back in 1945, or when the Genocide Convention was inked back in 1948, but it did quickly become that. And if you think about the very early actions of the UN, it really became that fairly quickly, with the UN, of course, passing a resolution to, first of all, create the state of Israel and to take away a huge amount of land from the Palestinians, and to greenlight the U.S. Invasion of Korea in 1950. These were some of the very early acts of the United Nations. The other one that comes to mind is the UN use of UN troops in the Congo to overthrow Patrice Lumumba in 1960. So again, I'm not sure that was why these things were passed, but I think very quickly the U.S. in particular figured out that, we could use this to our advantage. We don't have to be bound by it because we have the 82nd Airborne and no one else does. So, we're going to just use this against everyone else. And that's what they've done. And that's what they're doing right now.
So the hearing, the order that came down on Friday, this past Friday, was in response to a request for, I forget the term of art that they use here, something measures, but
temporary protective measures. Yes,
but it's an injunction. It's what you'd call a TRO or some other.
Yeah, that's what it is
in here. Those are used in essence to try to preserve the parties or the property at issue, or the conditions at issue, or whatever, until a dispute can be litigated properly, which takes some time. In this particular case, what we got for relief, what South Africa got was something, the 2 points that you mentioned. And now 30 days from last Friday to see if Israel issues the report and if they've behaved, and we've already had an indication of how they're going to behave. On the other end of it, what they're doing now flips the clock, because the shutdown of this agency means that no aid can be delivered unless there's another funding stream found, basically. The U.S. is the biggest funder of the United Nations. What can be done going back to court? I mean, if this were a case in the United States and this happened, say it was one of the states that did this, you would drag the state before the court and tell them, you're interfering with the order of the court here. The aid is now being blocked because of the actions that you've taken, and they would be accountable. Is there any mechanism that can be done at the ICJ?
Well, I mean, there are. And of course, in the U.S., in the extreme cases, we've even sent in the National Guard, right? Kennedy sent in the National Guard to Oxford,
Right.
Mississippi to integrate the university there. But, the ICJ doesn't have troops. The Security Council could order troops, could order embargoes, could order sanctions, as you, of course, have noted. The U.S. would most likely veto that. So I don't see there being a real process before the UN that's going to do anything. However, under the Genocide Convention in 1948, it says in Article 1 that the state parties to the Genocide Convention, which is most states in the world, have an obligation to stop and prevent genocide. Okay, so I think what can happen, and what is happening, at least in one instance, and that's in the instance of Yemen. Yemen is very clear that what they're doing in the Red Sea by stopping shipping to and from Israel is acting in accordance with Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. They believe there's a genocide. Now, of course, they have greater support for that because of the ICJ's initial decision. They're saying they're going to stop that traffic in order to stop the genocide. And what's going to have to happen is other states have to act as well in similar ways. Countries have to cut off oil. They have to sanction Israel economically. And again, maybe set up a no-fly zone, which there's precedent for that, over Gaza. Now, will those things happen? I don't know. I think the economic sanctions certainly could come. A no-fly zone, I don't know. But, how long is the world going to sit and watch this happen?
Right.
That's the question.
Right. How long before the population of Gaza is exhausted?
Right. Well, and you raised, as you said, injunctions are to try to maintain the status quo pending the case being litigated. What does that mean here? The status quo is trying to save the Gazans who are left alive. I mean, that's how terrible this thing is.
Right. You're trying to preserve the life of one of the parties. All right.
Yes.
Dan, thank you so much. We're going to continue to follow this, and we'll be speaking with you again, I'm sure.
Thank you, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.